from a few tens of thousands in Montevideo in 1930 to billions of people watching from every continent in 2026. In less than a century, the World Cup has gone from no prize money at all to hundreds of millions paid out every 4 years. The World Cup has become one of the largest recurring commercial events on Earth. Long before packed stadiums and billion-dollar TV deals, there was simply an idea and a small organization trying to give the game a global home. In 1904, representatives from a handful of European nations met in Paris to create a new body to govern international football. They called it the Fédération Internationale de Football Association, also known as FIFA. At first, FIFA was little more than a committee, organizing occasional matches between neighboring countries. At that point, the International Olympic Committee was already staging hugely popular football tournaments, but they strictly limited them to amateur athletes. The sport was exploding in popularity, and so was professionalism. The very best players were being paid and locked out of the biggest stage. FIFA realized the Olympic rules were keeping the top players out of the competition. So they began to campaign for a true global championship without amateur restrictions. At the center of that push was Jules Rimet, a French lawyer and idealist who believed, very simply, that football could help unite nations after the devastation of the First World War. He took over as FIFA president in 1921, and for years his plan for an independent world championship was dismissed as unrealistic and unpopular. Officials worried about travel costs. They feared clashing with the Olympics. They didn't know how to handle rising professionalism. But Rimet kept pushing, and at the 1928 FIFA Congress in Amsterdam, he forced a pivotal vote. FIFA finally agreed to stage their own World Championship and set the date for the very first one, 1930. Finding a host in the middle of a global economic slump wasn't easy. One small nation stepped forward with a bold offer: Uruguay. It made perfect sense. Uruguay were back-to-back Olympic champions, and they were preparing to celebrate the 100th anniversary of their independence. They even promised to pay the travel expenses for the teams who agreed to come. When Rimet, the new trophy, and those 4 European squads finally stepped off the steamship after a 2-week voyage across the Atlantic, they were greeted by jubilant crowds in Montevideo. Only 13 teams had entered that first World Cup, a heavily South American roster with 7 sides from the host continent. But despite the small field, the tournament was fiercely competitive and instantly loved. It all culminated in a final where the host nation, Uruguay, defeated Argentina 4-2 and became the first ever World Cup champions. The last goal was scored by forward Hector Castro, who famously played with only one arm. When Uruguay's captain lifted that trophy in a packed stadium on the edge of the River Plate, it sealed a legendary victory and hinted at what an absolute spectacle this tournament was about to become. After that massive inaugural success, the World Cup packed up and moved across the Atlantic. As it expanded to 16 teams in 1934, it slammed straight into the political realities of 1930s Europe. Italy's win in 1934 was quickly turned into a propaganda tool by Benito Mussolini's regime. 4 years later, in 1938, the tournament went to France, but by then, the global map was already fracturing. Spain stayed away, torn apart by civil war. Austria had to withdraw after being annexed by Nazi Germany. Several South American countries boycotted, furious that Europe was hosting for a second consecutive time. By the time the 1938 World Cup kicked off, the looming shadow of a global conflict was impossible to ignore, from the political symbols in the stands to the controversial salutes on the pitch. And then the storm broke. Just as the World Cup had established itself as the premier global event in football, the Second World War erupted in 1939 and changed everything. Early plans for a 1942 World Cup were discussed, then abandoned. The tournament disappeared. 12 years without a world champion. In those years, cities were reduced to rubble. Logistics collapsed. Entire nations fought simply to survive. Planning an international sports competition was out of the question. By the late 1940s, FIFA's funds were depleted. Ports and railways lay shattered, making long-distance travel almost impossible. And most tragically, countless brilliant young players had been sent to fight, with many never coming back from the front lines. The result was stark: a 12-year gap in the history of the World Cup. 12 years where the trophy stayed in a cabinet, and the game's greatest stage fell silent. But the beautiful game refused to die. With much of Europe still in ruins, a nation spared from direct wartime destruction stepped forward to host the next chapter: Brazil. For the 1950 World Cup, Brazil built something the sport had never seen before: the vast concrete bowl of the Maracanazo in Rio de Janeiro. On the day of the decisive match, around 200,000 fans packed into this colossal new stadium. Almost all of them expected a coronation, not a contest. Brazil were at home in a unique final group format where they needed only a draw to become world champions. Uruguay, by contrast, absolutely had to win. Early in the second half, the script seemed to be going exactly to plan. Brazil scored and went 1-0 up. The noise was deafening, but Uruguay refused to play the victim. Juan Schiaffino struck an equalizer to stun the crowd, and with just minutes remaining, Alcides Giggia slipped a low shot across the Brazilian goalkeeper and into the net. Against all odds, Uruguay had stolen the World Cup. At the final whistle, the Maracanazo fell almost completely silent. A stadium built for celebration suddenly felt like a tomb. The upset became known as the Maracanazo, the Maracanazo blow, a ghost that haunted Brazilian football identity for generations. From that shocking rebirth in South America, the story jumps forward 4 years to a sport that is faster, higher scoring, and increasingly televised. If you thought Brazil were favourites, look at Hungary in 1954, the mighty Magyars. Hungary were a footballing superpower. They went unbeaten in 31 matches over 4 years. They won Olympic gold in 1952. They humiliated England at home and away, 6-3 and 7-1. In the group stage of the 1954 World Cup, they destroyed West Germany 8-3. On paper, they were unstoppable, which brings us to the final in Bern. Facing that Hungarian super team once more was West Germany, a country still physically damaged and politically isolated just 9 years after the end of the Second World War. Within 8 minutes, Hungary were 2-0 up. Another massacre seemed inevitable. But then, the miracle began. West Germany fought back, scoring twice to make it 2-2. In the 84th minute, as rain fell on the Wankdorf Stadium, Helmut Rahn struck the winning goal to make it 3-2. Germany, the same nation that had been shattered and divided less than a decade earlier, were suddenly world champions. That match became known as the Miracle of Bern. For West Germans, it felt like a moment of national rebirth, proof that a country still struggling in the ashes of war could stand up again. So, how did the raw human genius we see on the pitch get packaged, monetized, and compromised by the very boardrooms that built its global stage. Brazil had just suffered a deeply traumatic home defeat in 1950. That shock forced a reset, and strangely, it cleared the way for a golden era. Leading that new era was a 17-year-old prodigy, Pelé. He arrived at exactly the moment the television age was waking up. In 1958, international TV broadcasts meant people could sit in their living rooms and watch his acrobatic volleys and impossible dribbles in real time. By 1970, when the World Cup was beamed around the planet in vivid color, Pelé and Brazil's dazzling yellow shirts became football's first true global myth. They didn't just win, they rewrote what the game could look like. But while Pelé was turning football into a universal spectacle, the politics above him were shifting. In the 1960s, FIFA was still highly Eurocentric, but the world map was changing fast. Decolonization meant Asia and Africa were forming new football federations. And every one of those new federations came with something priceless: a vote. João Havelange saw that landscape perfectly. He promised the developing world more World Cup slots and much-needed investment money. In 1974, backed by a coalition of these new votes, he broke Europe's grip on FIFA's presidency and rewired where power really sat inside the organization. But campaign promises are expensive. To pay for them, Havelange had a simple, ruthless mandate: sell football. He partnered with Horst Dassler, the heir to Adidas, to bundle World Cup TV rights and sponsorships into a single, global product. Exclusive rights were sold to marketing firms, who then sold them on to blue-chip sponsors. In one audacious move, they transformed football from a charming, almost amateur association into a highly lucrative commodity. If Pelé showed the world the power of a golden team, Diego Maradona showed what happens when a single player bends an entire, globalized, TV-driven event to his will. The duality is legendary. In the 1986 quarter-final against England, the match was already vibrating with tension after the Falklands War. Within 8 minutes, Maradona delivered the most scandalous cheat and the most breathtaking solo goal in World Cup history. First, he punched the ball into the net for the infamous Hand of God. Then he turned and ran past half the England team for what is still called the goal of the century, all broadcast live to the entire world. But the same cameras that immortalize a star can magnify their downfall. Cut to the 1994 World Cup in the United States. Maradona, now older and chasing one last high, is sent home in disgrace after failing a drug test for a banned stimulant. In an increasingly commercialized era, the scrutiny was absolute. Not even a living legend was above the machine. A dizzying, godlike rise, followed by a deeply human, painfully public fall. By the 1990s, the world itself was changing at breakneck speed. The collapse of the Soviet Union opened up new nations, new teams, and new markets. The European Union was integrating economies and broadcasters. FIFA surfed this geopolitical wave. They pushed the tournament into lucrative new territories, awarding 1994 to the USA, specifically to crack the American market. By France 1998, the finals had expanded to 32 teams. TV networks were throwing billions at bundled global rights, and we started to see the rise of new mega icons like Brazil's Ronaldo and France's Zidane. who were no longer just players. They were global media brands. Between the late 1980s and early 2000s, FIFA's marketing partner, International Sport and Leisure, ISL, turned the World Cup's rights into a private empire. Behind the scenes, ISL paid out staggering sums in commissions and kickbacks to top sports officials. This money became the standard cost of doing business. Bribes bought access, signatures, and protection for contracts. Eventually, ISL collapsed under its own debts. Swiss courts forced key documents into the open. The world learned that tens of millions of Swiss francs had gone directly to João Havelange and his former son-in-law, Ricardo Teixeira. When FIFA's own ethics judge reviewed the affair, he branded their behavior morally and ethically reprehensible. In practice, the consequences were little more than a slap on the wrist. The new president, Sepp Blatter, insisted he knew nothing, and the billion-dollar system kept humming. Unsurprisingly, this deep culture of secrecy and money bled straight into how host nations were chosen. A tiny elite group of FIFA executives voted in secret ballots in Zurich, and that vote mutated into an underground global market. For South Africa's 2010 bid, a FIFA insider later admitted that bribes had been paid around the vote. For Qatar's 2022 bid, leaked documents and emails alleged that millions of dollars were moved to influence support. In May 2015, the world woke up to the news of dawn raids on the ultra-luxury Bar au Lac Hotel in Zurich. Because secret bribe payments had passed through US banks, the US Department of Justice had jurisdiction to act. Over a dozen officials and executives were hit with racketeering, wire fraud, and money laundering charges involving well over $100 million. The scale of the case forced longtime FIFA president Sepp Blatter to announce his resignation. Under pressure, FIFA hired an independent investigator, Michael Garcia, who produced a 430-page report on the 2018 and 2022 bidding process. FIFA refused to publish it, releasing only a short summary that Garcia himself publicly called incomplete and erroneous. Even the cleanup became part of the cover-up, but the true cost of this machine was not measured in Swiss francs. It was deeply, tragically human. When Qatar won the right to host the 2022 World Cup, it had to build an entire infrastructure grid almost from scratch. Very quickly, a stark dispute emerged over the human toll. Qatar's organizing committee officially reported just 3 work-related deaths on stadium sites. Investigations by journalists and rights groups looking at embassy records from labor-sending countries pointed to thousands of migrant worker deaths in Qatar over the same decade. Qatar and FIFA said you could not simply label all those deaths World Cup deaths. But labor experts warned that many sudden deaths in extreme heat were being logged as natural causes rather than occupational injuries. Whatever exact statistics you lean toward, the core issue was the system the men were forced to work under. Kafala. Under Kafala, a migrant worker's legal status is tied entirely to a single employer. If that worker faces unpaid wages or dangerous heat, he can't simply quit without risking his right to stay. Qatar did introduce legal reforms on paper late in the process, but human rights groups argued enforcement was deeply flawed. In reality, many workers were trapped without a real pathway to refuse hazardous conditions. Heartbreakingly, When a proposal for a dedicated worker compensation fund finally reached the FIFA Congress after the tournament, it was voted down by 166 associations to 27. The organization that had made billions from the World Cup declined to guarantee a formal remedy for the people who built it. The institution's deeply entrenched political machine remained resistant to genuine structural empathy. The Worker Compensation Fund was still rejected. Ethics and compliance structures were erected, but the culture at the top proved hard to uproot. Despite decades of boardroom coups, shady kickbacks, geopolitical maneuvering, and tragic human costs, somehow the raw, undeniable passion for the beautiful game survives intact. The World Cup doesn't erase the scandals and tragedies we've seen throughout the years. But every 4 years, billions of people still gather around this tournament. It is both a global business, sometimes a dirty one, and a global language. And for all its damage, it still does something almost nothing else can. It makes a divided planet watch the same story at the same time.